Nick, you can take it away.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I very excited. Welcome everyone here today at lunchtime, and thank you again for your willingness and engagement in this process. I think we're gonna have a great chance to start getting into some more details and having some more conversations today. That's gonna be great. We're gonna have an update from Greg on some data, which should just inform our discussion even further, and then get into Q&A about that, and then a deeper conversation about starting to think about, okay, what are the types of recommendations we want to start based on what we've learned so far, and what you all, the immense amount of knowledge you all are already bringing to the table too. But before doing all of that, I am delighted to welcome back Hannah to join us and throw it over to her. She, as you know, is the Director of Housing Programs at the Mayor's Office, and the one who will be helping to shepherd this directly once our recommendations are made. So Hannah, with that, I'm going to throw it over to you.
Thanks, Mick. Hi, everybody. As Mick said, I am back, and most importantly, very excited to be back. I can feel the energy from everyone involved, and really hopeful that this is a year where we're going to be able to make significant progress on our housing challenges. I am getting caught up on all the work that the committees have been doing and the chairs and the group as a whole. So I want to thank you all each so much for the time that you contributed. And I'm really excited to sort of get down to brass tacks, hear from you on your recommendations, mine your expertise, and make sure that what we produce is, not just a report, but primarily our policy recommendations, funding, land use recommendations that reflect the sort of hard conversations that we're going to have together so that we can come to consensus, and then that this group, as you all are such influential, important voices in our community for this housing challenges and the tools that we produce, that each of you really feels confident and excited to go out and champion them in whatever the perspective arena is where we're looking to make progress in the coming years. So we'll be, trying to suss out places where we see trade-offs, potential challenges. We can't do everything, and so where do we find comfort and really buy-in on, maybe not comfort, maybe discomfort, but buy-in on, this is the direction we're prepared to go now. And we all know that it's not everything, but by committing to that and tackling something that we can make substantive progress on. And then I know we all know that this is a lifelong journey, that then we can continue to come back and say, okay, we've really made progress on that. What have we learned in the last 1 to 3 years? How do we need to adjust these tools? And now that we've really made progress on something, we can turn our focus perhaps to other, innovations, AMIs. Obviously, there's going to be all different arenas. We all know that the intersectionality of housing is immense. But I could not be more excited to be entering at this time as we really get into the nitty-gritty, and then, of course, the implementation. Going to council with our recommendations, going to the state, really, sort of ironing out what's possible, and showing the city how committed we are, and sort of as we have some wind at our back with federal funds and perhaps changes coming down the pike, being able to take those and really run with them and multiply our impact here locally. So, I know all of you have my email if you have thoughts, or you know where to find me, but I'm back and really looking forward to getting to work with this group. Thanks, Mick.
Thanks, Hannah. And then without further ado, I'm going to throw it over to our task force member, diligent data miner, presenter, everything, Greg Claxton. I don't know if you've got the ball yet, but hopefully you will short. Looks like you do. Take it away. Greg, I don't know if you've started
Yep.
speaking.
I was gonna say, Greg, yeah, you're muted,
Yep.
Greg.
Yeah, I
Gotta
caught
unmute
it.
for it.
Thank you. I apologize. Thank you, Mick. Thank you, Edward. Good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to give you an update on some of the ongoing work that me and my team were doing to support the data sort of backup data, or the data for this task force. A couple of things that we've got kind of going on in the background. One is ongoing work, as y'all know, on the inventory of affordable units and the projections for that. That's continuing. We're continuing to try to clean up and align some of the different programs. Second, we've started really over the last week or two an assessment of capacity of multifamily zone properties. That was something we talked about a fair amount a few weeks ago. I had presented kind of the amount of land in various zoning categories. Now we're taking a look at how built out some of those parcels are, and trying to get a sense of what the recent trends are in terms of recent property recently developed under RM20 or MUG zoning. Like how much building, how many units are we seeing out of those sites? So that's very, very preliminary. It took about a week and a half to just kind of assemble all of the data that we needed in one place, and now we've started trying to analyze that. The other two things I've got updates for, one is preservation program trends and projections. This is similar to what we presented in the past, but where I've tried to zero in on LIHTC and Barnes properties that are seem to be sort of rehab or preservation focused. And then the last thing that's going to take up the bulk of my time for the update is something the planning department undertook a little while back that I thought would be useful to bring to bear. This is a neighborhood change analysis. Now I'll get into that in more detail in a moment. All right, so first looking at rehabilitation projects funded by the Barnes Fund. These were projects we had pulled out of the prior trend analysis that we'd done. There haven't been a whole lot. You can see in the solid line, the historical trend was just funded these kind of projects in a couple of rounds. But as we did before, we kind of looked at the average each year over the course of the life of the Barnes Fund. It was about 25 units annually, and then just projected that forward through 2030 to get about 225 units preserved over that time. And then similarly, working again with the LIHTC data that Jeremy and THDA provided, here I went in and took a look at LIHTC projects that were marked as acquisition and preservation. And again, the solid line is the trend, and then the dotted line is the projection. Here we're looking at about 130 units per year, and we just projected that forward from the year which they stopped. So that's a little more than 10 years. I think it's about 15 years to get to 2,000 units. Again, this is something this is still preliminary. We're gonna dig back in and talk with Hannah and Ashley and Jeremy to make sure I'm pulling in the right stuff. But we are trying to put a little bit of the trend and projection together for the preservation group. I know that was a concern when we talked previously, that it was primarily new unit construction. Okay, so the neighborhood change analysis. This was something we were asked to take a look at a little while back. It was we did it using a model from a report in Austin called Uprooted. It was done, I think, at the request of the Austin City Council, but was conducted by some folks at the University of Texas at Austin. It's a very detailed, extensive report, and so I'm just going to show sort of the mapping portion of it, so y'all can see kind of if you replicate this in Nashville, what it looks like. But their whole report is much more extensive than what I'm going to get into. A couple of things I want to note at the outset. One is that we really did just attempt to replicate it. There's a couple things that we've started doing to see if we can update and extend it, but none of that is ready, or not sure it's even feasible yet. A second thing that I'll note, and I'll kind of hit on this again at the end, is that in our work in zoning, subdivisions, and sort of community plans that shape zoning and subdivision decisions, it's very difficult to draw a clean line between the categories of gentrification that this study is looking at and how to think about a specific land use decision. So this isn't thing that we've attached to those decisions yet, because they're very complex and often indirect. But it is something that we think is worth exploring and understanding kind of how these different factors fit together. So with that out of the way, a quick overview of the structure of the analysis. It's based on three demographic factors that are all rooted in census data, the American Community Survey. One is identifying vulnerable populations throughout the county. All of this is at the census tract level. So, you know, I'm going to use the report uses, and I'm going to use kind of neighborhood and census tract interchangeably. But the part is, where are vulnerable communities located, and how do those different vulnerability factors stack up? A second is, where is demographic change happening throughout the county, and where are different aspects of demographic change stacking up? And then the third, and this was a slide that I provided to Lucy for her talk on Monday, is where is the housing market changing, and where might the housing market change next? So I'm going to walk through each of these factors in a little bit more detail. Okay, so the vulnerability analysis is looking at 5 factors. And again, all of this is census data based on by census tract. Percent of residents who identify as anything other than non-Hispanic white. Percent of residents lacking a 25 years of age and older, lacking a 4 years bachelor degree or more. Percent of households with incomes below 80% of the AMI. Percent of households who rent. And then the share of children in households below the official federal poverty line. And so here the analysis is basically just saying, you know, kind of giving a yes or no score on each of these factors to every census tract in the county, and then adding up how many factors apply in that census tract. So the ones that show here, the ones that are used throughout the rest of the analysis, have at least a higher level than the countywide average on 3 of these factors, on at least 3 of these factors. So you can see the pink, the red, the maroon, kind of 3 factors, 4 factors, and then all 5. This is for me, looking at this is a very common pattern that we see in Nashville, this sort of reverse crescent. I think I've mentioned it in past presentations, but this is a very common kind of pattern of where households with these kind of demographic characteristics show up in a bunch of different ways in the county. The next set of factors are looking at homeowners, adults over 25, a bachelor's degree or higher, the percent of the population who identify as non-Hispanic white alone, and then median household income. And here the census tracts, the neighborhoods, are picking up where those factors are increasing. This one's a little bit more complex. I can't explain the exact counting mechanism, but it's essentially looking for a couple things moving at a higher rate together, but it's not as simple as the other one, which is just, is it higher than the countywide average? We're going to add up how many factors it is. But with the mechanism that the Austin researchers put together, on screen, the census tracts in green are the ones that show demographic change. And this is from 2000 to the ACS vintage of 2015 to 2019. And again, in terms of the urban core, this is a fairly expected pattern. We think that the outlying thing is there's mostly some oddities going on there with Bellevue or in the far southeast. I mean, not that the data is not true, but it's we think that it's not the core of this analysis, but it showed up, so we wanted to present it. The next piece is looking at the housing market, and again, this is continues the trend of using census data, so it does lag. That's one thing to note about all of this data is that it does lag things a little bit. Here, the analysis is comparing 3 points in time. Home values in 1990, home values in 2000, and then home values in the most recent ACS year that we have, which again, I think was 2019 to 2015, or 2015 to 2019. It uses kind of where home values are at compared to the rest of the county in 3 different ways. One is accelerating tracks, where you have low to moderate home values in 2000 that's risen to the higher part of the county in the present time. Second is appreciated tracks that had lower moderate home values in 1990, and then had strong appreciation and are now in the higher values currently. And then the next one is areas that have lower moderate home values in 2000, low change from 2000 to present, but are adjacent to higher value tracks or appreciating tracks. And so those show up, the appreciated in red, that's ones that have been high value for a little while, accelerating in green, that have seen their home value start to rise, and then those adjacent tracks show up in blue. To try to provide something a little bit more timely, we've looked at using assessors data, and it's because of kind of disjointed things and like what we know and what we don't know in assessors data. We haven't had any luck bringing that in yet, but that is something we hope to do at some point. Okay, and then so UT researchers take these 3 factors and look at how they combine in different ways to put together a typology of kind of where neighborhoods are at in the kind of the process of gentrification or neighborhood change. And so we've identified kind of 5 types, 5 kind of positions in that typology. The first is susceptible neighborhoods that have vulnerable residents that have not seen demographic change yet and are in those adjacent. So they're next to areas that are starting to appreciate. These are in green. The next in the maroon shading are early gentrification neighborhoods that have vulnerable residents, have not seen demographic change yet, but have seen the real estate markets begin to appreciate. Then the next are dynamic change neighborhoods in red that have vulnerable residents, that have seen demographic change, and that where the real estate market is appreciating. In pink are the late neighborhoods that still have vulnerable residents, still undergoing demographic change, but their home values have already appreciated, so they are now high home value neighborhoods. And then the last is sort of continued loss neighborhoods that no longer have a greater share of vulnerable residents in the county as a whole, are still seeing demographic change and have appreciated home values. So that's kind of where those play out, are shown on here. Now, obviously, there's some things that, like when I first saw this map, I had a lot of questions about in terms of sort of the southern part of East Nashville, Wedgwood, Houston, Edge Hill, 12 South, those kind of neighborhoods. And you can kind of go through and pick out why it wasn't picked up by one type or another. Generally, my sense on these is that they gentrified sort of before the time frame of this study was looking at, but that's kind of an area that we could dig into more. So I'm going to come back around to the point I made at the start in terms of how we think about this. One of the things that's that kind of intuitively makes sense to me looking at this, that I think the UT researchers reflect as well, is that to a certain extent, the real estate market begins to change before you see really widespread demographic change. And because of that, it's really tough to say that there's a firm land use response, like in terms of just pure zoning, not kind of where you make affordability investments, not where you try to do inclusionary zoning, but just purely from a matter of, we're going to change the zoning one way or another. It's hard to know kind of what the response ought to be. There's a lot of folks who sort of see appreciating starting to happen. They see teardowns and larger rebuilds going in. And so their instinct is to say, well, no, you need to downzone to discourage that. Small homes can appreciate just as much as large homes can. So it's not necessarily a solution. On the other hand, there's a response that, well, no, you shouldn't rebuild as giant single family. You need to rebuild more densely. There, the evidence seems a little bit more mixed in terms of, does that stop rent or home value increases? It doesn't seem to, although it may slow it down. So this is something where we've been trying to think through kind of what does the implication of this mean for like planning decisions, like not just the broader community planning that we do, but if a zone change comes to planning commission, we think it's very, very difficult to draw a straight line from being in one of these categories to the decisions that we have. So I just kind of want to bracket this in terms of kind of my job with the planning commission. And with that, that's the data update that I have. I'm happy to take questions or shift back to the broader group's discussion.
Greg, this is awesome. That's really good data. I really appreciate it. I see, we'll just go straight into questions. I see, Kay, you've got your hand up. And Kay, you're on mute. I'm not sure if you started.
Excuse me. So Greg, if we could go back to one of your very early slides, one of the preservation slides that showed the trend of about 136 units annually being preserved. With the model that's used for LIHTC typically in Tennessee, it's rare that you'll see projects under 100. Most often the number of units you will see is between 200 and 300. Mick can help me out on that. So in terms of, for example, one project right now, it's acquisition preservation approved for a LIHTC, and it's 436 units. It's in West Nashville. So I just want to point that out to you, that typically if someone's going to acquire a project, if it's a LIHTC project aging out, they're going to be acquiring more units than 136. So just something to think about when you're calculating your numbers on that. And then I'll let someone else jump in, Mick.
Thanks, Kay. Any other questions? While I wait to see if anyone gets a hand up, and I'm happy to start moving on to our next topic as well. I think Greg's gave us a great place to jump off from. So moving on to the next phase of our discussion, where we start talking about using some of this information in all of our experiences to talk about policy solutions. But I do think part of it, Kay, is I think the numbers will often work at smaller scales than 200, 300, 400 units on an AC rehab LIHTC preservation. It's just that those things are not, those types of apartment complex aren't hitting the market all that often as well. So that's another part of it all. It's sort of an opportunity defines where these things end up going as well. So that's part of it. But I think you make a really good point.
Yeah, and just one thing to keep in mind for all of these is they're just straight line projections. So it kind of assumes that it'll be up and down in any one year. So
okay, thank you.
I see Kelsey's hand up, and then Hannah's. So Kelsey, floor is yours.
Thanks. Greg, I'm curious if that Austin report had any kind of tangible takeaways of like action items that they, uh, using this data, then led into their kind of housing blueprint.
It had I don't know the connection to the housing blueprint, but it did have an extremely extensive list of kind of recommended actions that were kind of from improved community planning to, you know, the kinds of things that we've talked about here, you know, kind of more use of bonus programs, a lot of sort of things in the realm of housing stabilization, housing preservation and creation, and then you know, things like, you know, first right of first refusal for tenants and buildings that go up for sale, like that kind of thing. So it is, and I'm happy to I should have put it in here. I'm happy to put a link to it when we send the PowerPoint around. But it does have an extremely extensive list of recommendations.
If I may just jump in real quick about that question about the Austin Housing Blueprint. This was the document that I sent out, I believe about 2 weeks now, but I can recirculate it so everybody has a chance to see it. And if there's some time today, I'm happy to pull it up and we can take a look at a couple of the data pieces. But that said, that blueprint was produced in 2017. And so since this analysis came out in 2018, I have a feeling, my guesstimate, okay, is that these are new data to use for, you know, analyzing what is happening in Austin proper. And that might not have been available at the time of the blueprint, since the blueprint, you know, it took them, I think, 3 years to develop the blueprint in terms of the community engagement process. But that is my guess. So the timing was off. So it'll be interesting to see what the recommendations are in Uprooted.
Awesome. Thanks, Dia. Hannah, floor is yours.
Greg, this is awesome. You do such great work. If I think you're spot on in terms of it's not clear, you know, as you were talking, I was thinking, well, we don't want to freeze neighborhoods. That's not what we hear from neighbors, that we want no change, but we want to be able to participate in the changes that comes. Legally, would we be able to make tools based on those areas that you have sort of outlined if we were to even sort of come up with a land use tool? Would that be considered, you know, enough justification? You've got great data there, but would that be allowable under state law?
I don't know that I'm equipped to handle that on just a general statement. I mean, it sort of depends on what the tool is, I think, to a large extent. I expect that we have plenty of tools that are geographically focused. So it would kind of depend tool by tool.
But in terms of like upzoning, which we've talked a lot about, that seems doable. That doesn't get so much into state law, right, Greg?
That's right. That's right. I mean, if you're like, I don't think, I mean, you don't have a right to an upzoning. So we've been told we can't take affordability, like the provision of affordable units, into account at Planning Commission for upzoning. But, you know, sort of the general, you know, overall policy goals are fine. And, you know, it's just a matter of articulating what those are.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, this is just so helpful. Well, next we're going to have a chance, you know, try and set this up right. But, you know, I think looking back, you know, especially about the zoning question and what's going to be possible, what's going to be legal, what's going to be, you know, legal under state law. I think Lucy on Monday pointed to potentially there's some partnerships that are maybe out there between planning and, you know, MDHA, where we can sort of figure out ways where we can bring our different stakeholders and government, quasi-governmental organizations together to get some of these outcomes that we want that we haven't been able to do sort of in the silos of planning by itself or MDHA by itself. She sort of alluded to that possibility, I think, on Monday. Also, on Thursday, Professor Beth Shin did a great outline of the potential impact of housing choice vouchers on helping to end homelessness. I'm bringing these up to stoke the fire for our next conversation of what we've heard so far, and starting to get down to, as Hannah mentioned, brass tacks in terms of what we can be doing and thinking about and pursuing and pulling apart these questions and trying to figure out a way towards recommendations that we can make in the next several weeks. So with that, I'm going to throw it over to Edward to take us through to their next step, and I think Dia's got a great tool that'll help frame this conversation. So with that, Edward, I'm going to hand it to you.
Awesome, and hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Can I get some thumbs up if people can hear me? Okay, great, wonderful. Well, again, we have, and Mick was highlighting a few of the most recent ones, but we have and we'll continue to have some great conversations on the multitude of topics that are associated with and affecting affordable housing. But I think it's important, especially for where we're getting ready to take ourselves in our task force, is really understand we all do speak some forms of different language, or what I would say we all have different dialects in how we speak about things. And so I think it's important that we do respect that sometimes there may be some challenges, right, in terms of our level of communication. But our duty is to have these detailed conversations, and sometimes difficult conversations for the greater good. But again, we're all here because our goals are aligned, right? There's so much experience and expertise, and maybe even more important than both of those, passion for what we do. It's the perfect situation for what I like to consider an iron sharpens iron type of forum. And so I feel it's my responsibility, and Mick, I tap Mick, and I often speak for Mick when we're in this position. But as chairs of this task force, I think one is to foster that healthy and inclusive discussion, and hopefully, as task force members, you all feel we've been going down that path. I think also, to beckon participants to contribute in areas where they're strong, but also to listen and be open-minded, to the opinions of others, their beliefs, and honestly, their strategies, right? Because we can say one thing is that if it was done well already and the problem was already solved, we wouldn't be here. So we do have to be open-minded to some things that are being brought to the table and aptly push where we need to push. And then again, I think to enable and to steward the development and prioritization of our collective recommendations. And so when we think about that, I want to transition that as we start to enter the next stage of our task force, where we're tasked with developing recommendations. I'm going to tap Dia because we've drafted a tool that we want to have our committees use as a starting point, right? It's not the framework that's to lock you guys in, but we do feel that it's something to get us started. And what we want to do is use that as a starting point for collecting those recommendations and understand the context and where we wish for you guys to have those recommendations established. So Dia, if you have the ball, I think I'll let you grab the screen and take over from here.
Thanks so much, Edward. And as I pull up this document, I do want to say Edward raises something that is so important in group decision-making processes. When you pull together a group of, we're about 23 strong on this video conference today. And when you pull a group together that represents so many different areas of expertise, financing, construction, development, planning, data analysis, policy, community engagement, the community voice. What we're really looking at is a team, the right team at the table. But we all look at this issue from the standpoint of our expertise. And that is the language that we each speak. So sometimes we really don't speak the same language. And so when we are out of our very specific area in this topic of affordable housing, we sometimes use shorthand. So if somebody says, multi-income, multi-use property to me, I have an idea of what that means. But if that person is an expert in that field, they probably have a slightly more technical definition than I would, okay? And so as we begin to collect the recommendations from everybody around the table and from across all of these disciplines, finance, law, home ownership, community land trusts, I mean, on and on and on, we have assembled quite the expertise across the spectrum. We really need to allow each other some grace about what these recommendations are and what they produce. So I also wanted to get to Hannah's comment about brass tacks, getting down to brass tacks. As you know, Mayor Cooper really set the charge for the task force. He wants actionable items, which means we are focused on the very near term, years 1 through 3. So as we collect your recommendations, one of the criteria we're going to be looking at is what can go live in years 1, 2, or 3, and what can go live after that. So it really means that recommendations are not just going to be about planning to get something done by year 5. It really means what can we stand up in year 1, 2, or 3, and what really will stand up in years after year 3. So that's going to be one of the criteria as we start to whittle down the recommendations. The other piece is really going to be results focused. So Greg, who's done just a superior job in putting together data analytics for us, what he's really doing is sharing with us what is the trend line in the production and preservation of units in the programs that are currently under the sphere of influence of the city to some degree. So LIHTC Barnes pilot. And what is a forecast, a straight line forecast, assuming we do nothing, assuming we have no recommendations, okay? So that gives us a sense of, as we put our recommendations together, what will be the result of each policy or intervention that we put down for years 1, 2, or 3? Will the result be new units created, annual units? Will the result be, sort of annual units preserved? Will the results be new capacity to better plan? So we really want to take, some time to be sure as policies and interventions get teed up, and as the subcommittees go into deliberation and really look at each of the recommendations their committees are putting together by a set of criteria, that we're really honest about what can be produced in terms of results. It's a tricky business, getting a really good number about what is the number of units Nashville needs, what is the number of units Austin needs. There are limitations with a lot of the equations out there for how cities come to that number. In the Austin blueprint, we discovered, of course, that based on their equation, honestly, they're just keeping pace with the gap in their city based on the growth of population. So these are some of the tough issues that we're going to have to navigate as a committee. And I just really want to encourage you, the reason why we have such great co-chairs as Edward and Mick, and we have committee co-chairs, and that we're staffing it with Hannah and myself and John Bunton, is that there is support for this dialogue that might have to be translated at certain points. So if you need to grab one of us and talk to us more specifically about your recommendations and would prefer that we help you with a translation on that so we can make it accessible to everybody across the task force, we would be delighted to do that. Our role here is to be sure that people are really communicating and not just connecting, and that we can get to some real brass tacks, as Hannah was saying, so that there is a real year 1, there's real action for year 1, 2, and 3. That said, we have, as you know, in the early part, sort of in February, we looked at a framework. We have an overarching goal. We might want to narrow that goal a little bit more, or we might be satisfied with that goal. And that goal is that Nashville housing is accessible, available, and affordable to all Nashvillians. And then we took a look at some of the baseline data that Greg produced early on, and we talked about why is there this shortage? What are factors that contribute to the shortage? What are factors that work against the shortage? We also looked at some other questions about how did we get here? What happens if we do nothing? These are all questions that are based on a methodology called results-based accountability. And we went through the full framework for both committees, both subcommittees. And now we're at the jumping off point to begin to put together recommendations. So over the next few weeks, we're going to pull together the work that we did in February with the development of recommendations. And we're going to have to fine tune those documents so we can prepare them for public consumption. But primarily first for decision making here in the task force so we can tee up the highest priorities for years 1, 2, and 3. With that, I'm going to share with you a tool which is a, okay. So since this is up first, this is the framework, the facilitation framework we did on February 11th for the creation committee. So you can see this was our overarching goal. Here were the baseline indicators we were looking at that time, the data that were available at that time. We will have more data to use. That's why we'll be reviewing these again to be sure that this really represents the dialogue we want to produce publicly. And then here are some of the strategic questions we talked about: factors restricting the creation of units, factors contributing to the creation of units, what's happening today to create this data story. If we do nothing, what will that look like? What programs are contributing to the story? What's working to create units? So this is really preparing us to go straight into recommendations. So what you're going to see next, and what you should be able to see on your screen, is the policy and intervention collection table. Does everybody see that on their screen? Okay. And this is already up in SharePoint in the subcommittee folders. The point of this document is to collect all recommendations right now. We are not going to employ a criteria until we have a full universe of recommendations, so we understand better the vantage point that everybody has around the table and what they're seeing from their specific expertise and experience. And then based on that, so everybody will be able to access this in the SharePoint folder. And I'll be sure to send the link so you can get to the right place. So you start on the left. This is just a Word table. It will be, this is a collaborative document, so more than one person can be in it at a time. So the first thing you want to do is, what is the policy or intervention that you're interested in recommending? And you describe it here. Does that policy or intervention have a specific AMI target group? If so, please put that percentage here. Are there features that really speak to equitable impact or sustainability in that particular policy intervention? You'd want to explain that here. What are some of the blind spots of that policy intervention? Does it only work in certain circumstances? Does it only work, in certain zoned areas? Can it only work if there's new revenue for it? I mean, those are very important blind spots. Or has it not worked at all in, say, communities of color? I mean, these are things we need to know as we move forward. The go live time. This is, if we implement this recommendation, will its results be available in year 1, 2, or 3? And so what are those results? Is it annual units saved or created, or is there another result there? This task force has really talked about the need for the kind of data analysis that Greg has been doing for us, which is really a new role. It really means, grabbing good data from across different agencies and making them work to help us support decision making. So that's a new role. So we've talked about that being one of the recommendations. If that's a recommendation, then the result there is not units created or preserved, but the capacity to make decisions, right? Or to support a decision-making process around where to invest funds to support affordable housing development, right? Who's the contributor? There is only one rule on this shared table, and that one rule is that whoever contributes this policy on this line, they're the only people who can change it in this document. So if you did not contribute this policy or intervention, we just ask that you share your comments or questions in this column. So as time goes on, you know, we are going to have to make adjustments no matter who was the contributor of the policy or intervention, because as I love Edward's comment, iron sharpens iron. You know, the mayor gave us a high bar. He said he wants actionable items. And actionable items have to be measurable. They have to have a real result. We have to know as best as we can when those results will go live. And that the levers that we're recommending, the policy levers and interventions, are evidence-based and tried and true. There's a moment to try absolutely brand new ideas. And, but this is not one of them. We need some tried and true activities here that can create results in years 1, 2, and 3. And that is the biggest challenge for this task force, is to get to measurable results and impacts. So I challenge all of you to join us on this journey. I won't lie, we will try to make it as smooth as possible, but there are always bumps in the road. So, you know, fortunately, there are a number of us around the table that you can reach out to. Certainly my inbox and my phone is always open to you all if you have questions about next steps or how we're proceeding or how to get information. So we're here to help. So what's going to happen next is these documents are up and ready. Next week on March 11th, we transition to the subcommittee meetings again, which means that preservation subcommittee meets at noon on Thursday, March 11th for 90 minutes from noon to 1:30. And the creation subcommittee meets at 5 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. on Thursday, March 11th. And so during those meetings, by then, we are asking all members to put in all of their recommendations that they would like to have discussed at this time. It would be great as you put in your recommendations or your policies and interventions that you'd like to have part of the action agenda, that you really think about what is doable in years 1, 2, and 3. That is a critical criteria for us right now. If you have items that you know will fall in years 4 through 10, you can add them. These are things we can identify, but we really want to prioritize years 1, 2, and 3. We know if we make some of the right decisions now, it will create a foundation for some opportunities in the future. And that's what we really want to do, is be judicious about the resources we have so that we can build towards the future. Okay, I'm happy to take questions.
Berkeley, I see your, oh, sorry, Berkeley, I see your hands up.
Dia answered the first question, which was, yes, I can put things in for years 4, 5, and 6. I just need to identify them that way, which I think is good, just to have the rest of that. And then second, we can work on both subcommittees documents if we have ideas across. You know, if I'm on the preservation committee, can I still put ideas on the creation documents? That's my.
Okay, so that's a great question. And the reason why we broke it up into subcommittees is it allows for more in-depth conversations, because obviously we're going to persist in this virtual environment till the end of the task force and the launch of the report, right? So on that question, I think what is really important is for right now, if you can just put in your recommendations in your subcommittee's documents. We will, as you know, as part of the work plan, there's an opportunity once subcommittees have had a chance to really, you know, review, refine, prioritize, their list, we will then swap those lists. So if you don't see something that is on the subcommittee, on the other subcommittee, you will have a chance to put it on there. So there will be opportunities to do that.
Thank you.
Kay, I see your hands up as well.
Yeah, I think Berkeley answered it, but I just want to reaffirm this. And going back to what John Bunton shared with us from the very beginning, that we know that this piece, whatever it turns out to be, that happens in years 1, 2, or 3, is tied to things that need to be occurring in the future in order for us to continue to address this. So there's got to be some way to capture that, because, you know, it's like the flywheel idea. Some things got to have some time to get going, but once they get going, you're going to see higher production and higher numbers. So I just want to be able to work within that concept.
So we've always talked about focusing on years 1 through 3 with a latter focus on 4 through 10, but being very measurable, or as measurable as we can, about years 1 through 3. So most planning happens conditionally anyways. You know, if we do this, then this will happen. So it builds those consequential steps that you're referring to, Kay, so that developments can go, you know, to scale. So absolutely. And that is definitely a bit of a challenge, right? We know that in the built environment, we're better when we can plan at 6-year periods, you know, to have consistent funding. The reality is and this is something we will talk about in the action agenda itself in the final report, is that we are working with some limitations here, one of which is coming out of the pandemic. And there is uncertainty about what that financial future is going to look like post-pandemic. So it does limit our ability to be robust in our recommendations. So I appreciate your point. Okay.
Thank you.
Edward, I saw your hand up, but I saw it go down again. So I'm going to call on Marshall, and then you jump in after that.
No problem. And good afternoon, everyone. In looking at the doc and all of the recommendations that are on here, is there a reason why there isn't anything that mentions funding or resources or dollar amounts that pertains to this, or was that intentionally left off with that regard?
Marshall, good afternoon, and thank you for that question. So the tricky thing about creating a collection table is, you know, what are some of the initial features that you need to know, and then what do you add on as the conversation goes on? I think if you know for certain your policy intervention is going to cost $3 million and that has to come out of the Barnes Fund, and you want that in there, you should describe that. Okay. So that really goes in that first column right here in terms of the description of the policy intervention. Okay. Because if it's not there, it will come out in the comments and the questions over here, and certainly during the discussion of your during your subcommittee.
Now this is great.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing on that, Mick?
Yeah.
Yes, I would welcome that to be in the policy, obviously, and then that will impact the result or unit impact. So, and if you're more focused on the tool than the amount, then you can also put that, you know, I want this tool to exist, and for each $1 million that we can commit, I think we're probably in this ballpark. So, you know, it doesn't have to be, I've done all of this analysis on my own and here's what we can guarantee. But obviously the conversation in being able to look at different tools and compare them will need some quantitative analysis. And then I certainly welcome on the Barnes front, you know, all of us have been in the conversation about Barnes over the long term, and we know it's a constrained environment currently, but I think some of that, of course, always is when you're trying to sell something, we need to be able to make a really clear pitch about not only what is Barnes' current value, and we leverage every dollar 6 to 1. That is great. But with an additional 10 million, we could have a preservation-focused fund that's able to do a 30-day turnaround in reviewing deals or whatever that might be. So I really encourage these policies to think. I'm glad you brought up the money, Marshall, not only about what we currently have, but with an additional this, not just that it would go to the Barnes Fund, but that it would go to the Barnes Fund in geographic areas, in specific, preservation versus new creation, partnerships for specific small nonprofits, whatever that might be. I would really love to see people make the case for why that tool should exist. And then I think that strengthens our discussion to be able to say, okay, you said this specific thing for Barnes, and this other person said something different that's specific for Barnes. Let's hash that out again, sort of back to my initial comments, so that what we come out with, we're not all going to get everything that we want or we think is really important for the city today. But then if we go and we say, you know what, I can see why Barnes is going to go in this direction in the next 3 years, but we've all sort of said it also needs to go in this direction starting in 2024. And so really, really looking and excited for specificity as much as possible here, so that, again, as we get to brass tacks, instead of just saying Barnes needs more money, how can we create a really convincing roadmap as we go to council, as we go to corporate partners, as we evolve, that captures the specific impact that your tool, your policy intervention is going to be able to make for our housing landscape.
Thanks, Hannah. That's great. Great context. Well, I'm just going to jump in here. We've got 30 minutes left. We did a great conversation on Monday about land use and zoning and neighborhood change. And we had a great presentation today from Greg that talked about the same topics from a data perspective. I would love, given that we've already been time for this week, to see if folks have immediate thoughts about potential policy interventions in that particular area. And one of the reasons why I think this might be particularly good for today is land use and zoning impacts both creation and preservation. And I think we originally highlighted today about talking about, part of this conversation is about displacement too. So I would encourage people to be thinking about that as well. But I think we've got 30 minutes here. We've got all these great people. We've been talking about this for, 2.5 hours so far, from including today and Monday. So I'd just love to open the floor. I see Berkeley's hands up and see if people want to start talking about policy recommendations right now, and then we can continue them in our subcommittees too. So Berkeley, I see your.
Thanks. I just want to prime the pump a little bit. One of the conversations about affordability in other groups that I've been in has circled back around to gentle density and the allowance of detached accessory dwelling units. And I have a bill that's working its way through right now, not without opposition, surprisingly. And to me, as a preservation tool, that has the possibility to allow someone to stay in their home because they can create a source of income on the backside of their property, but continue to live there. And they're also creating more affordable housing on the backside of their property if that tool is created. But I am astounded at the response from neighborhoods to whom it will not even apply, who are dead set against it. So I say again how important our outreach is going to be. And I would love the backing of this committee on that as a tool for both preserving and creating affordable housing.
That is awesome, Berkeley. That is a great example. I think it is something that touches on both of the things. It fits in nicely. So Berkeley, keep us informed about what we can do. I know there's sort of for any policy change, there's a sort of ground game communicating to different stakeholders. I don't know what this task force should play in that particular exact thing, but it's good that we're all aware that this is a conversation, and I would love for you to continue to keep this at the front and center, because I mean, personally, my personal bias is that this is a great potential policy tool to help create and preserve. So I agree with you. That's my bias too. So I love that to be a continued recommendation, but that's for later on whether that gets on there. So thank you. Please keep us posted. Gina, I think your hand was up next.
Yeah, and echoing a little bit what Berkeley is saying, you know, it's a shame that, you know, you've got this great bill that is facing the opposition. And I think many of us attend a lot of community meetings around town in different neighborhoods, and the story is not necessarily different. And I think for me, one of the recommendations, and it's not a necessarily right away a unit creator, but let's look at some kind of, you know, community education. You know, there are things that can be provided to the neighborhoods, provided to the council people. When we're talking affordable housing, this is what it means. I know when I'm in a lot of these neighborhood meetings, we'll have a broader discussion. And when you can break it down to a smaller group of people and really talk through it, it's amazing really where that goes. But I think giving tools to people to be able to effectively do that and sort of take away the initial bias and NIMBYism, it's always going to be there. And I think this is kind of something that will be continual that you'll have to do. But I think it may then help long-term with these zoning discussions and these changing land use discussions, because I think until then, the initial reaction will always be, what is this going to do to directly affect me? But if we're really being proactive about that, I think that could be helpful.
I couldn't agree more, Gina. I'm really glad you brought that up. Mick, I'm sorry I keep stepping on your toes, but I'm glad you brought that up, because it's so easy for us to get honed in on the unit count. And I know that was something at the very beginning of the task force, you know, access really matters. And that's access to actually the neighborhood and, you know, trying to build space in a neighborhood for new residents. And so I think that we all know that we can put the money out there, and if no one can get the neighborhoods to accept a project, then, you know, we're really still at the same spot we are. So I'm so glad you brought that up. And I think I would encourage people not to be deterred by the unit count, and maybe we can even change the language there to say value created. And if there is a unit count per million, great. If not, if it's a catalyzing effect, if it's an investment in broad education or specific, you know, equitable community organizing, whatever that might be, I would love to see really creative ideas on here, and then be able to make the case for the whole task force said that we need education, and so here's why we're making that investment in it.
Awesome. Kay, I think you had your hand up next, and then Edward after that.
Yeah, I have 3 points that hit 3 topics. The first one on the great lack of housing for the very low income, extremely low income, and what are tools that can make that happen. So the first is very specific. Go into discussions with Normandy, my good friend at MDHA, about the idea of targeting X% of vouchers to serve this population. Example today, one project has been approved that's being built for 118 vouchers, project-based vouchers, not housing choice. And those vouchers are going to serve people with incomes at 30% and below. You got to figure out how to make the numbers work. That's point number 1. Point number 2, in terms of having the right information or the best information to plan, I would like to see for us to get finished to the point that we can, a housing inventory, affordable housing inventory. Look to Austin's inventory. It covers NOAA's as well as anything with a government subsidy or a government guaranteed loan. And then we have that, we say, okay, where is that? So that's point number 2. Point number 3 is investing in a social impact revolving loan fund that will help with low cost money to invest in preserving affordable properties.
Thanks, Kay. That's a great list. Edward, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Mick. I wanted to say, you know, Councilmember Allen, I think what you're doing is great. I always believe that the more tools you have in your toolkit, the better you can build anything. And so we as a city need to understand that we need to continue to build our collection of tools. So I again, with what Mick said, I echo what you're doing. And then Gina, I don't know if I could have said what you said any better. I mean, it was exactly, it was like I wrote it for you or something. So just showing support for you and Kay and what you guys have just stated. But for me, I'll pick up a little bit from where I left off on Monday. Is I think what we really have said as a committee a lot of times is that there's still a lot of information and right dovetailing behind Kay, there's a lot of information that we still don't have. I mean, I don't think we fully grasp the nature of how significant our housing crisis is. And I feel like there's a need to assess that. And of course that takes resources. And I mentioned equipping planning with the resources, and resources being people, right? Funds to hire personnel to really focus specifically on assessing, one, our housing inventory and what we're dealing with, but two, I really think an in-depth density study is needed. That's my personal bias, is that if we are a city that said we want to have a lot of preservation for our green space and our active and civic open spaces, which I agree wholeheartedly with, that needs to be done in conjunction with the density study for the areas that are zoned residential now and maybe transitioning into residential. So I think those two things are complementary. And as far as what Gina said with educating the community, I think that's a need. I think there also needs to be an olive branch and a counterpart to that is specifically for the developer change agent group. Because very similar, you know, if you can't get the community to support something, it really doesn't happen. If you have all these tools and you have all these funding set aside and you don't have the development side of things in place to really take advantage of them, or if there's a stigma that these things will still be very difficult to do with the city, they again won't take advantage of them. And so we'll have some great options, some great tools, and some dollars that will sit on the shelf because we have not done enough priming the pump, so to speak, for folks to be ready and able to use it.
Yes, awesome, Ed. Gina, see your hand up as well.
Yeah, I got one more. Ed, you said a few of the things I wanted to say, so I was glad to hear you say that. And Greg, I want to say to you that all this information you have provided in the last few weeks is just extremely helpful. It really helps paint a picture. And just on the Barnes Fund, I know we are frequently saying to ourselves, it would really be wonderful to have the data in front of us to understand if we should change things in our application to shift to fund certain things. If there's a certain need, Barnes should be able to react to that. And we do not have the ability to do that because we don't have the resources to do that. And I think that is probably the case, like Ed said, for all of our actions across the city. So I think just really focusing on that would make a huge difference for all of the things that we're doing. And again, it's not necessarily an outcome. Like you said, Dia, it is something that we invest in to really help our outcomes in the next few years.
Awesome. Great. Marshall, see your hand up.
Yeah, I would just add also, you know, what Greg showed us this morning around, you know, community concentration and where individuals are living and how individuals are moving out in certain areas, that we also be mindful about the concentration of poverty and where we're putting low income and the lack thereof of mixed income properties that are being developed. So if we can speak to and really look at that from a systemic issue and address some of the neighborhoods and some of the areas where we have that concentration of poverty and how we mitigate some of that and break that up from a policy standpoint, I think is really critical that we give that some thought, and that we also be very mindful as we are deploying resources and asking others to contribute, that we are not continuing to perpetuate a situation, and that our communities become more diverse and more mindful from an income perspective and not only from a race standpoint.
I think that's so important, Marshall. That's really good. And sort of a lens to look through all of the different recommendations that we think through, from information gathering to the actual intervention itself, the creation or preservation of units. Great. Eddie, I see your hand up.
Picking up on what Marshall said, okay, I'm just as an observer, and I think you'll understand what I say, Mick, because we're doing many things. Is this conversation has sort of drifted into the theoretical, in the sense of, in a best case scenario, we could do all of this, which is fine. And I think that's the purpose of this, is to throw new mud on the wall, to combine different types of mud and see if one sticks longer. That's fine. But the thing that we've really got to do, and I really want to encourage us all, is we have got to start with the reality of where we are March the 4th, 2021, which is what Marshall said. We have focused on doing affordable in low-income communities for one reason. The land is cheap there. Okay, and that's because of the history of equity and race and everything else. But he is right. I mean, we've got to figure out how to, and everybody has said this at some point in time over the last month or so, is we really want to find a way to disperse the affordable. But the reality is land costs. So whenever we start sky blue and figuring that out, how are we going to address the land costs? That's a really critical issue, so that we're not continuing to pick on the same neighborhoods. And what was fascinating about what Greg gave us is those neighborhoods ain't low income anymore. They have moved on. And it's almost sad is that North Nashville has moved on after the tornado. We did very little to keep that neighborhood integrated and economically integrated, which was too bad. But and the other thing is about the money, is that, and I know that you're going to hear some, we're going to talk about money this evening, and we'll keep money there. But when we come up with new ideas and new mud, let's always ask the question, how does that get funded? And it may be, to Kay's point, we do a new funding source, which is what they've done. So that's my main point, is let's just make sure that when we start creating the mud and we start coming up with new ideas going forward, that we always root them back to key issues like land costs and construction costs and those kind of things. That's it.
That's awesome, Eddie. Thank you so much. And I think that's great. And I think there's a question here, a policy question that what we're all convened here to talk about is, do we want to spend our limited public and or private dollars maybe spending on neighborhoods of really, really high opportunity and buying that land with our public resources and doing fewer units? And that may be and we can empower the mayor's office, the Barnes Fund, to go and say, hey, we're going to give you more money if you build in neighborhoods of higher opportunity. You know, this is a question, like, I think what you bring up is great in thinking about the reality of the situation and the trade-offs that we're all sort of here to discuss. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts about that, but I'd love to hear them, because I think we know we've got a huge shortfall of units, and we know we can't continue to concentrate property. They're both sort of unacceptable circumstances we find ourselves in. Kay, I see your hand up. And you're on mute.
Do that every time. Sorry. One piece that's important to me to line up is to line up all the current known funding sources, what comes in on a projected annual basis for home dollars, what's available, what's realistically available from the State Housing Trust Fund. Line up those numbers under each of those sources, and then you go to the public possibility land piece, Metro land, MDHA land, line up those. And then you go to the voucher side. I guess if I had a whiteboard, I'd show you on the whiteboard. But that's what I'm trying to get to, is line those up and say, here's what we got now. Here's where gaps are. And then think of how to backfill that gap. And this tension that we have in reality between looking at Greg's numbers that show us where the greatest need is, right? And then the high cost of trying to help create economic mobility for people, which may not be putting them in that neighborhood where the land is less expensive. It may be in another neighborhood. So you're not going to be able to serve as many of those people where the need is great. That's just tension. I think we just have to acknowledge and say, okay, we acknowledge it, and here's how we're going to deal with it. Thanks.
That's great. Kelsey, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I think to that point, it's an opportunity for us to strategically deploy the differences between preservation and creation. So if we're able to preserve existing housing in neighborhoods that are at risk, that we know are going to continue to change, but that currently are more affordable, then that might allow us to allocate additional resources to do new construction where the land and where essentially the land is more expensive because the costs of construction are consistent whether you build it in one neighborhood or another. So I think keeping that in mind, that different strategies might need to have that distinction of a geographic filter.
Yeah, that's a way to think about it. Greg, I see your hands up.
So one thing I've been wondering over the last year or two is, when we think about the opportunity for affordable housing in high opportunity neighborhoods, I think thinking about publicly owned land is certainly a big part of that. But also if there are opportunities with sort of long-term sort of institutional landowners, hospitals, colleges, universities, community colleges, churches. I know we've had a little bit of rough experience with that in Nashville, but seeing what we can do to sort of broaden the pool of people who may have a mission-driven interest in doing that, to sort of soften the land cost piece of that.
That's great. So that's going along the lines of a recommendation to outreach to these other folks in town that have big land holdings, that have a long-term interest, that may find if we can help facilitate them using that for affordable housing, that could be a win-win for everyone involved.
And I would say, I think that's one of the benefits. This coordination has its own benefit, because I'll hear from someone, oh, I'm a church, we'd love to do that, but we don't know how to get started, and so having like a really easy entree for them to, here's this report and here's the person you should contact or the process that you should go through to raise your hand, so we can make it really easy for people who have assets out in the community to, high asset, low experience, to be able to sort of come right into this coordinated group that can put their work. So I don't know if that will be captured as necessarily policy intervention, but I'll certainly capture that as something that we can roadmap as a group to say, great, here's the place that they should come to versus just sort of cold calling around town. We know that not everyone's going to take that kind of effort to put their land to use. Great idea, Greg.
Thank you, Hannah. Councilmember Sawara.
Thanks, everyone. Great conversation. And I think what I had in mind probably was already said by someone ahead of me. But I was thinking about those alternative strategies. And I do see Greg just talk about churches and other landowners. And I do see where different cities would allow churches to rezone their parking lots, because most churches will have a huge parking lots that there's no building on, that they would allow them to rezone it to be able to put buildings on them. And so other cities have done it. I don't know if we've ever done that before, but that's an area that I think that we can definitely look into. I also like the idea of the map that was shared, of looking at adjacent areas. So if land is very expensive in one district, what about the next district over? that is not yet gentrified, that the cost is not that high, but we still have a vulnerable population. And so it's not in that opportunity zone specifically, or where that land is expensive already, but it's close enough that we might be able to have that benefit. And I thought those are two ideas that just jump into my head, and we'll keep thinking about them and keep looking at what everybody's doing and keep brainstorming and hearing all the great ideas. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you. This is great. I found this incredibly interesting, and I just love hearing all the different perspectives and ideas from all of our task force members. So really enjoying it. I think we're making really nice progress.
Can I ask a really quick question, a specific question about that? Greg, what would be the opportunity to make something that's somewhat cookie cutter? And of course, I know we can't do anything linked to affordability, but let's say the church has their own requirement for the development to be affordable. Would we then be able to say, here's the streamlined process for someone to come in and, sort of here's what if it has this, footprint, here's a fast track to being able to develop something. And we're not the ones saying that there's an affordability restriction. The landowner, if they're doing a long-term lease, would be the one doing that. Would we be able to create something like that as a city?
I think so. I thought Codes was already fast tracking permits, but I mean, it could be.
Yes, we're fast tracking permits, I guess more the development, the footprint, so that there's not the constant back and forth, the review of the plans, to be able to say, if you do something like this footprint, then, it's to take some of the guesswork out of it, sort of to Ed's presentation on Monday.
I think that will be tough with the rezoning process, because that specifically is where the state prohibition is. But certainly I think we could, and there may be, sort of community support reasons not to rush it. Like even if we could build a process, but I think that's something I can talk with everybody else about and, see if we can come up with something.
But Greg, if it's a church that's has land, if it's, just think the village at Glencliff, right?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, some of it comes down to how they're zoned already. I mean, churches already have zoning. Some of it gets into issues that I cannot speak to in terms of what counts as a religious land use, which get sort of carved out in a certain set of exemptions. So it's tricky in a bunch of different ways, but I mean, my sense the one at Glencliff was a pretty drawn out fight. So
it was.
Yeah. So, I think that there's opportunities there, but I think the virtue of it is they are a long-term stakeholder, not necessarily, and you want to make it easy for them. And I absolutely take Hannah's point about sort of the high asset, low experience. But it may also be that you look at it as a sort of supporting a long-term process and a long-term interest rather than high production fast. But again, I think there's things to sort of figure out and think through in that.
Awesome. Well, I see Kelsey's hand up, and this will probably be our last question/comment before we start to wrap up. Kelsey, the floor is yours.
Hannah, I really appreciate your comment about streamlining things. And I wonder if there's an opportunity to do that with other tools too, like a community benefits agreement might be a great way for us to encourage and require affordable housing without running into the inclusionary zoning issues, but CBAs can also be incredibly difficult to actually pull off. So is there a way that we can have a template or a process or a framework that makes that a more approachable process? Just one example of how we can kind of streamline these tools so that they exist, but they're also accessible for folks who, again, might have that high asset, low experience.
Hannah gave it the thumbs up, so I think that's a yes. But this is great. So I'll just quickly got some land use things that we talked about, parking, all these types of things, some educational information, sort of key recommendations, I think coalescing, thinking about the location and mixed income communities and addressing the structural inequities that our city and our country has sort of instilled over the last 400 years is also another big thing that we need to keep at the forefront of our minds. This afternoon's presentation will be, and conversation will be great. You'll be talking about the finance side of some of these topics, or maybe all of these topics in some way. Ed, I feel like I've been blabbering on a lot here. Do you want to say anything more about this afternoon's presentation?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, everyone, please plan to join us this afternoon at 5 p.m. where we will focus on, again, the very critical, right, component of affordable housing, which is financing and finding ways to do so, to really understand how these projects come together, how they're structured, both legally and financially. Again, you know, to Eddie's point, we have to understand where we are today and build upon that. And so we'll be hearing from Eddie this afternoon. Eddie, of course, is the CEO of the Affordable Housing Resources and our task force member. Also, fellow task force member Dwayne Barrett, who's the managing member of Reno Kavanaugh, will be speaking. And then we'll have a task force guest speaker, Tom Amdur, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he's the president of the National Housing and Rehab Association, as well as the Tennessee Developers Council. And so he'll be presenting and leaning in on a lot of strategies and giving us a much wider view across our nation of ways we can approach things. So just encourage everyone to partake in that. And again, it will add further information to what Dia showed us earlier in terms of our chart and our tool for gathering our recommendations. So I look forward to seeing you all then.
Thanks, everybody. Hope the conversation's got wheels turning for us to fill out those tables in the next week or so. So I really appreciate it. Thanks all.
See you all soon.
See you soon.